In ancient Mesopotamia, every so often, a new king would do something extraordinary. He would climb to the top of the temple and proclaim what was called a clean slate. A fresh start. All debts were cancelled. Debt slaves regained their freedom. Lands confiscated from indebted families were returned. Hammurabi did it 4 times. Other Mesopotamian kings did it too. Not out of generosity. Out of survival. Because they knew that if debts grew without control, society would fracture. Indebted farmers would abandon their lands. Indebted soldiers would refuse to fight. And an empire without farmers or soldiers does not last long. The question of what to do with debts when they become unpayable is not new. It is one of the oldest questions in civilization. And the answer each society gives to that question reveals its deepest values. Is debt a sacred obligation that must always be honored? Or are there moments when forgiving debt is the just, the necessary, the humane thing to do? Today we close this season with the hardest question of all. Throughout this season we have seen how interest works, how compound interest amplifies everything, how central banks use rates to manage the economy, what inflation is and what happens when it spirals out of control, what happens when prices fall, and how debt drives economic cycles. Today we take a step back and look at debt from a different perspective. Not the technical one. The moral one. The philosophical one. The human one. Because behind every debt figure there are people. And the question of whether those people must always pay, no matter what, or whether there are circumstances in which society must say enough, is a question with no easy answer. The idea of periodic debt cancellation was not exclusive to Mesopotamian kings. It appears codified in one of the most influential texts in history. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, the Torah establishes the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, debts must be forgiven. Slaves freed. Lands returned to their original owners. The logic was profound. The land belongs to God, not to men. Therefore, it cannot be sold permanently. And people, created in the divine image, cannot be permanently enslaved by a debt. It is not clear to what extent the Jubilee was actually practiced. Historians debate whether it was a real practice or a theoretical ideal. But the idea is powerful. It says that the indefinite accumulation of debt is incompatible with a just society. That debt needs a reset mechanism. David Graeber, the anthropologist whose book Debt, the First 5,000 Years we have mentioned in previous seasons, argues that the Mesopotamian clean slates and the Hebrew Jubilee were practical responses to a real problem. Without a forgiveness mechanism, debts tend to accumulate to the point of fracturing society. Ancient civilizations knew this. And they codified the solution in law and religion. The medieval Catholic Church turned the prohibition of interest into one of its firmest theological positions. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, refined Aristotle's argument. Charging interest on a loan, he said, is charging for time. But time belongs to God. Charging for something that belongs to God is stealing from God. It was an elegant and devastating argument. And the Church enforced it severely. Usurers could not receive the sacraments. Could not be buried in consecrated ground. They were, for all practical purposes, excommunicated. But the medieval economy needed credit. Merchants needed financing for their expeditions. Kings needed money for their wars. And so an ingenious parallel system developed. Exchange contracts, as we mentioned in the first episode, disguised interest as profit from currency exchange. Bills of exchange financed international trade with an implicit margin that was, in everything but name, interest. The Monte di Pieta, created by the Franciscans in the 15th century, offered loans to the poor charging a small amount to cover costs. Was it interest? The Church said no. Critics said yes. The debate was fierce. And Jewish lenders, as we have seen, filled the gap that Christians could not openly fill. They lent at interest to non-Jews, as their law permitted. They became indispensable. And they became hated. The association between Jews and money in the European imagination has its direct roots in Christian usury prohibitions. It is one of the darkest consequences of a religious law applied to the economy. Islam took a different path, one that deserves more detailed explanation. The prohibition of riba in the Quran does not distinguish between moderate interest and abusive interest. All interest is prohibited. The fundamental reason is that fixed interest guarantees the lender a profit regardless of what happens to the borrower. And that, for the Islamic tradition, is unjust. The alternative developed by Islamic jurists is based on risk sharing. In a mudaraba contract, one person provides the capital and another provides the labor. If the business goes well, both share the profits according to an agreed percentage. If it goes badly, the investor loses their capital and the manager loses their time and effort. Both assume risk. Nobody gains at the other's expense on a guaranteed basis. In a Musharaka contract, both parties put in capital and share both profits and losses. And in a Murabaha contract, the bank does not lend money. It buys the good the client needs and resells it at a higher price, payable in installments. There is no explicit interest. There is a commercial margin. Is it really different from interest? Critics point out that in practice, the financial results are often similar. Defenders respond that the structure matters. Risk sharing creates a more equitable relationship between the parties. Islamic finance moves more than $3 trillion in assets worldwide today. It is an enormous industry that demonstrates it is possible to build a functional financial system without explicit interest. Whether it is genuinely different or a label on the same reality is a debate that remains open. In 19th century England, if you could not pay your debts, you went to prison. Literally. Debtors' prisons were an established institution. Charles Dickens, whose father was imprisoned for debt in the Marshalsea prison, immortalized them in his novels. In Little Dorrit, the protagonist is born and grows up inside a debtor's prison. The logic was perverse. If you cannot pay, we imprison you. But in prison you cannot work. And if you cannot work, you cannot earn money. And if you cannot earn money, you can never pay. The system condemned the debtor to an impossible cycle. Debtors' prisons were gradually abolished throughout the 19th century. And their abolition reflected a profound shift in thinking about debt. People began to accept that sometimes debt is unpayable, not because of the debtor's wickedness, but because of circumstances beyond their control. And that society needs mechanisms to manage that reality, bankruptcy laws that allow a fresh start. Today, personal bankruptcy exists in most Western countries. It is an acknowledgement that unpayable debt destroys lives, and that keeping someone trapped forever in a debt they cannot pay benefits neither the debtor nor the creditor. In 2010, the world discovered that Greece could not pay its sovereign debt. The real deficit was much larger than the government had declared for years. What followed was a crisis that divided Europe. The Troika, International Monetary Fund, European Central Bank and European Commission demanded austerity in exchange for bailouts. Greece received €110 billion in 2010 and more afterwards. But in return it had to cut wages, pensions, healthcare, raise taxes, privatize public assets. The results were devastating. The Greek economy contracted by 25%, unemployment reached 27%. Among young people, more than 50%. A quarter of the country's wealth evaporated. The argument for austerity was that Greece had lived beyond its means. It had spent more than it earned for years. And now it had to pay the consequences. The argument against was that Greek citizens had not decided the policies that created the debt. But they were paying the consequences. The cut pensions were not suffered by the politicians who had lied about the figures. They were suffered by retirees who had worked their entire lives. In 2011, a 50% haircut was negotiated on Greek debt held by private creditors. €100 billion forgiven. But the debt-to-GDP ratio kept rising, because the economy was contracting faster than the debt was being relieved. The Greek crisis put on the table the most uncomfortable question in modern economics. When a country cannot pay, who should bear the cost? The citizens, who did not create the problem. The creditors, who lent knowing the risks. The taxpayers of other countries, who financed the bailouts. There is no easy answer. But the question is essential. On a different scale, the same question arises in the United States with student debt. More than 42 million Americans collectively owe around $1,800 billion in student loans. It is the second largest debt category in the country, behind only mortgages. An average student graduates with about $30,000 in debt. Many owe much more. And the interest, which as we saw in the episode on compound interest accumulates relentlessly, means that many end up owing more than they borrowed even after years of paying. Advocates of student debt forgiveness argue that the system is broken. Universities have raised prices disproportionately. Graduate salaries have not kept pace. And an entire generation is weighed down by debts that prevent them from buying homes, starting families, and contributing fully to the economy. Opponents argue that forgiving debt is unfair to those who already paid, to those who chose cheaper universities, or to those who decided not to study. They argue it sets a dangerous precedent and that the cost is borne by taxpayers. Both positions have valid arguments. And the tension between them reflects something fundamental. Debt always has two sides. Every debtor has a creditor. And what benefits one harms the other. Throughout this season we have explored three forces that are deeply connected. Interest is the price of time. It determines the cost of borrowing and the reward for saving. Inflation is the price of everything. When it rises, money is worth less. When it falls too far, the economy stalls. And debt is the bridge between present and future. It allows consuming today what will be paid for tomorrow. But when it accumulates to excess, it can destroy economies and societies. These three forces interact constantly. Central banks raise interest rates to control inflation, but that makes debt more expensive. Inflation reduces the real value of debts, benefiting debtors but hurting savers. And excessive debt can generate both inflation, if it is monetized, and deflation, if it collapses. Understanding this triangle is understanding the invisible engine of the modern economy. You will not see these mechanisms presented this way, with this clarity, in the news. But they are behind every central bank decision, every financial crisis, every economic policy debate. Debt is not just a number on a balance sheet. It is a power relationship. When a country owes money to another, the conditions of the loan can dictate its domestic policy. Greece experienced this. Argentina has experienced it repeatedly. Sub-Saharan African countries experience it today, dedicating an enormous share of their budgets to servicing debts contracted decades ago, on terms that often benefited the lenders more than the recipients. When a family owes money to a bank, that debt conditions all their decisions. What job to accept, where to live, whether they can afford to have children. Debt is not just economics. It is life. And the fundamental moral question remains the same one posed by Mesopotamian kings, Hebrew prophets, Greek philosophers, and medieval theologians. How far should the obligation to pay extend? Is there a point at which debt stops being a just obligation and becomes an unjust chain? Every society answers this question differently. And that answer says more about its values than any political speech. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the cancellation of debts is one of the oldest practices in civilization. From the Mesopotamian clean slates to the Hebrew Jubilee, ancient societies knew that debt without limits destroys the social fabric. Second, the prohibition of usury shaped the financial systems of 3 civilizations. Christianity prohibited it and circumvented it. Islam prohibited it and built an alternative system. Judaism restricted it among co-religionists. In all 3 cases, religious law had enormous economic consequences. Third, the debate about the morality of debt is not historical. It is alive. Greece, American student debt, developing countries trapped in sovereign debt, the question of who should pay and when it is just to forgive remains without a single answer. We have explored the price of money, the force of inflation, and the machinery of debt. These are the invisible forces behind every economic decision. But all these forces operate in a place where buyers and sellers meet, where prices are formed, and where the rules of supply and demand govern everything. In the next season, we enter the market.